In this tutorial, we're going to be using Adventure Creator to rebuild the adventure game that Unity have made as part of their own adventure game tutorial series. What I've got here is a fresh project, and all I've done is imported the finished project that Unity have made as part of their own adventure game. So it's available in the Asset Store under Adventure Sample Game. And this is the finished game when you follow the Unity's own adventure game tutorial, which is available from their Learn pages. What I want to try to achieve with this tutorial is to show how the same thing can be done without any scripting using just Adventure Creator. This is going to be a little bit different to the other tutorials in that we're going to be taking existing scenes and adapting them to work with Adventure Creator. Now that does mean this is going to assume that you have a general or at least a basic understanding of how Unity works, its various principles such as animation, its interface, and Unity UI. But that said, I am going to try to keep things as simple as I can, so hopefully if you are new to Unity, you can still follow along. I'm going to be doing this with Unity 2017.1 and the latest version of Adventure Creator, which at the moment is version 1.60.2. So you can download the finished sample game from the Asset Store. I'll put a link to this in the description. And all I've done so far is imported that complete game into my fresh project. And we can actually run the game to see how it plays. So it's a fairly simple game, but it has some nice graphics and animation. We've got this security laser here that we want to get past. We've got this receptionist here that won't let us through. And we also have a sign of Frank Jobsworth in the corner here. So we want to dress up as him, disguise our way in. We can pick up a red herring because no adventure game is complete without some bad jokes. And we'll find, if we walk over here to the left, we've got a disguise here. We can't reach it, so obviously what we have to do is click on a bird, and the bird will fly up and knock it down for us. If we then click it, she'll then automatically put it on. We now have that equipped. Finally, we just need to get a cup of coffee. If we click on the coffee machine, we need to pay a coin, which we can find here in the vending machine. And you can see as I'm picking everything up, my inventory is filling up here. Now if I click again, my coin will be replaced by a coffee cup. And we're now ready to go back to this the security room. And fool this guard. So go back to him, he thinks we're Frank, and we go up to the lasers, and game complete. So, fairly simple, but I do think it does a good job of demonstrating the basics, or the base mechanics of what most adventure games tend to have. Before we can import Adventure Creator, what I'm going to do is just adapt these scenes so that we're going to remove everything that is already here to do with any gameplay logic. So because we're going to be basically rebuilding it from scratch. So I've got my market scene open. I found this in Assets, Scenes, and then Market. And what I'm going to do is highlight all of these objects except for this Market game object. And then I'll just delete all of those. And that means that all we've got here is just our scene with our lights. We've got a baked nav mesh. If we go to the navigation tab, we can see this is already done for us. Now, as I said, this tutorial does involve a general knowledge of Unity, so please go and have a read up of things like nav mesh and navigation before continuing. But with that said, we can now save this scene, and I'll do the same thing in the security room. I'll select everything except for the security room game object and delete them, save. And finally, if I go to the File Build Settings, you can see that we've got a third scene, Scene Persistent, which is also the first scene, and I'm going to uncheck that to prevent it from being included in builds. So now we're ready to import Adventure Creator and start building. Adventure Creator can be also downloaded from Unity's Asset Store, and I've downloaded it and imported the project as we've got here. Now this is the window that appears when you import something. You can choose which files get imported. Adventure Creator has two demos, a 2D demo and a 3D demo, and what I'm going to do is just omit those from the import. So I've got my Adventure Creator folder. Inside that we've got 2D demo, and I'm going to uncheck that. And if I found it, we've also got this demo folder, and I'll uncheck that as well, just to make the import a bit faster and the project files, the project size, keep it smaller. Now, once it's finished importing the scripts, it's then going to show up this installation window, and it's basically just telling us that it wants to automatically add a new input and a couple of layers. So we'll just OK that. And once it's complete, we then get some messages in the console to say that those have been added. Now, Adventure Creator works with a manager system, and each game that you make with AC has its own set of managers. And there are 8 managers, and each manager controls a different aspect of development. For example, the inventory manager handles your inventory. And we can show them all from the top. We go to Adventure Creator, Editors, and then Game Editor. And I'll dock it into this vertical space here. So you see we have 8 tabs, 1 for each manager, but we don't actually have an asset file assigned. Now this is normally the demo is assigned here, but we didn't import the demo, so we've got nothing here. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the new game wizard to automatically create a new set of managers for us. We can do that by going to up the top, Adventure Creator again, Getting Started, and then New Game Wizard. And here it's just a case of filling in the boxes as we click Next to go through each page. So our game name is going to be, let's say, Unity Adventure Remake. Our camera perspective is going to be in 3D, and this is going to be a point-and-click game. Our interface is going to be context-sensitive, and that's the most simple of all of these options, and it basically just means a one-button interface. Whereas we click on something and we use it. It's very simple. The other options are to do with, say, having different verbs or different icons for our hotspots. But as we're recreating the Unity game, we're just going to leave it as this context-sensitive mode. Our GUI system, we're going to, well, we have a few options. We can either have no GUI and just rebuild it from scratch, but I'm going to choose default Unity UI, first to be a little bit different from the other tutorials, but also because even though we'll end up changing this probably quite drastically later on, it just makes it easier when building a new game, because it has all of the menus like for inventory and save games and things like that, so that we can actually just start building gameplay right away. Next again, we'll just confirm all of these choices are right. I'll choose Finish, and a few seconds later, we'll see here in the Game Editor window, these managers are now populated with fields, and if we find we've actually in the project window, we've got a subfolder of the same name as the game, Unity Adventure Remake, and in here we have a manager package file and 2 subfolders. We've got one for our UI, we've got another one for all of our managers. And if for some reason these managers are no longer assigned in the game editor, maybe because we installed an update of Adventure Creator, or we wanted to check out one of the other demo games, we can quickly reassign all of these just by double-clicking the manager package file. And that's just a convenience asset to load all of these in if these become unset. Now you can see, because I used the new game wizard while the security room scene was open, it's gone and added a bunch of folders and a game engine object all for us. That's because this has been converted to an adventure creator scene. We'll actually come back to this. I'll do this all properly later on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File, New Scene, because what we're going to do now is create our player. Let's now go and create our player for the game. Now, because this is working backwards from the Unity completed adventure game, we've already got in our prefabs folder the same player that game used. So what we're going to do is we're going to adapt that to work with Adventure Creator. So if I drag the prefab into the scene, let's take a look at what we've got. We've got an animator, a nav mesh agent, and a couple of scripts. Let's delete the two scripts, and we'll also delete the nav mesh agent. We could actually rely on the nav mesh agent if we wanted that. We would then just have to add the nav mesh agent integration component. But if we just leave it all off, then all of the movement will be controlled by Adventure Creator. Now we're going to use the character wizard to convert this character into an AC player. I'll reset the transform so that we're at the origin. And then I'll go to Adventure Creator, Editors, Character Wizard, and I'll dock this to the side like so. Choosing Next, we'll be asked, is this a player or an NPC? This is going to be a player. We're then asked to assign the character's base object. So I'll drag the player from the scene hierarchy into this field. You have to be careful, we can't use a prefab, this has to be the scene object. It will then try to determine what the animation engine is going to be. It says, do you want this to be a mechanism character? Which we do, because mechanism is an alternative name for Unity's animator system, which, as we can see from this animator component, we're going to be using. Choose Next again, just confirm everything and finish. Now you'll see that we have a collider around this mesh now. If we scroll down, we've got a rigid body and a capsule collider. Now, the original prefab did not have a collider, and we only generally need one if we need it for two reasons. We need it, one, if we want the player to be colliding in the scene with either, say, the floor if we wanted gravity, or other NPCs if we wanted to have evasion and things like that. But we also need a capsule collider and rigid body if we want triggers to work. And as we'll see later, we do want to have triggers in our game. So we'll leave these two components on, but I will also enable the isTrigger checkbox just so that the collider is used purely for triggers and not for any kind of collision. I think I'll also reduce the radius a little bit, like so, and I'll maybe reduce the height if I want to be really accurate. Now, going up through this new player game object, we've got an audio source, we've got a couple of AC components, and this player component has a lot of settings, most of which we can ignore, at least for the moment. At the top, we've got our animation engine, still set to mechanism. But then we've got this mechanism parameters panel, the first of which is this move speed float. Now, all of these parameter names are the names of parameters in our animator controller that AC wants to control during gameplay. So this move speed float will be any float parameter that will be controlled by AC and will take the form of the character's movement speed. So if we open up the controller's click to move controller, actually I'll remove this character wizard here, we can see that we've got a few animations that play when trigger parameters are called. And we've also got this idle and walk pair of animations that transition between one another according to this speed float parameter. So if they're playing the idle and the speed becomes greater than 0.1, he'll transition to the walking. She'll transition to the walking animation and vice versa. So by entering speed as our players move speed float, AC will set this value automatically during gameplay. We also have a talk bool already set up for us as isTalking. So if we were to have a Boolean parameter named isTalking, that would be set to true whenever the character is talking. But we don't have any talking animation, so I'm going to remove that. We also don't have a jump bool, so I'm going to remove that as well. I'll make this a new prefab in our Unity Adventure remake folder. I'll just drag it in like so. And then we'll make this the default player in our settings manager. So if I go to the settings tab, this is where all of our game-wide settings are. And underneath character settings, we have a field for our player. And so I'll assign our new player prefab in there. And that means that whenever we begin our game from any Adventure Creator scene, this player will be spawned. Now let's go and start converting our two scenes into Adventure Creator scenes. Let's start with the security room because it's a little bit more simple. And I say that because the camera doesn't move. So as before, we've removed all of the game objects except for this security room sort of main object that has all of the lighting and so on. And in the scene manager, which is where we organize anything related to this specific scene, we don't have full controls because we've not yet converted it. Or as in AC terminology, we haven't organized the room objects. And we have two options. We can do it with folders or without folders. The with folders brings up the empty game objects that we saw before. But I'm going to do it without folders, just so that we've got as few objects as possible. And you can see we've now got a player start, a main camera, and a game engine object. Now the player start, you'll see, is also, we've actually got this expanded window now. The player start is marked as the default player start for the scene. And a player start is used to record where the player begins when entering the scene. And if we begin the game from this scene, we'll use the default player start as we've got here. So this is where the player will begin when we run the game from this scene. So I'll position and move it around like so. And just to demonstrate, I'll run the scene. And you can see the player is positioned here. Now, oh, and I can also show we've actually got this is the inventory bar. We've got a menu button here. I can access the pause menu. This is all because we chose the default Unity UI option when we were creating the new game managers. Now the camera is in the right place, or it seems to be in the right place. But actually, if we go into the scene window and I select the main camera, which is actually where any pointing and clicking and raycasting is done, the main camera is actually still at the origin. The camera that we can see through the game window is actually inside this security room, camera rig, and then camera object. And this is the one that's doing the rendering, but it's not being used for raycasting. And that's very important when we come to work with navigation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually disable this camera. Just the whole object from camera rig, I'll disable it. And we're going to create a new Adventure Creator camera. So I'm going to go into the Scene tab, and we've got a default camera field just below our default player start. And if I click on Create beside it, it'll create navcam1 and assign it automatically as our default. So we've got navcam1 here. Now, this being our default camera, when we run the game, the main camera is going to snap itself to this camera's position and rotation. So I'm going to put it in roughly the right spot. I mean, I suppose you could do things like copy transforms and so on if you wanted it to be exactly as before. But I suppose that looks okay to me. Oh, if I want to see it in the game window, just note that the camera's component is actually disabled because at runtime it's not doing any rendering. So this will be disabled automatically when we run the game. Run the game now, and we now have the camera, the main camera rather, in the correct spot, as we can see in the scene window. So now we can turn our attention to pathfinding. Now if we run the scene, you'll see we're getting an error message, no nav mesh set, characters will not be able to pathfind. So first of all, we need to determine what our pathfinding method is going to be. Now we're going to be using Unity Navigation, and in our scene settings, our pathfinding method is currently set to Mesh Collider. And that just means instead of having a baked nav mesh, we can supply just an actual mesh object, and it'll use the vertices of that mesh for its pathfinding. Let's change this to Unity Navigation. And if we go to the Navigation tab, you'll see that we've got this baked blue nav mesh already made for us, and this is all part of the Unity tutorial. And all we need to do now is mark out the area this same area with a collider, because when we click on the floor, we need our clicks to be caught, if you like, by the raycasting. Unity's adventure tutorial has already covered something similar, because if you go to the security room root object, you can see that we've got a mesh collider that covers, in this faint green line, that covers the same area as the nav mesh itself. And that's what with the mouse cursor is going to be clicking on. So to get it working with Adventure Creator, all we need to do is change the layer that it's on. So, you can see I've already done this in a practice for the tutorial. I'm going to set the layer from the default to the nav mesh for this object only. And I think just because we're not using it, I'm going to remove this event trigger script as well. So now when I run the scene, the error message is no longer coming up, and we can point and click around the scene. If you want to see what's going on behind the scenes, you can click on Gizmos, and then you'll get this blue line appearing whenever she's walking around. Before we go and add things like hotspots and NPCs and so on, let's go and do the same thing to our market scene so that we can walk around our entire game world before adding any logic and puzzles and things like that. So again, we have a single game object, or rather a single root object that has all of our geometry and lights in it. In the Scene tab, I'm going to again organize the room objects. With folders, without folders, it's your choice really. And again, we've got our player start, our default player start here at the origin. Now this player start is only going to be used when we're testing, because the finished game won't start from this scene. So this player start will only be used if we actually run through testing the game from this scene. Our camera, again, we've got this old camera from the Unity tutorial, and I'm going to again disable this camera from the camera rig object. I'll just disable it, and then create our own one, again from the AC Game Editor, and choose default camera to create navcam1, and I'll try to position it in roughly the same kind of place. I'll make it zoom in a little bit, maybe 50, field of view of 50. And let's go to the nav mesh. So the navigation tab again shows us that the scene has already been baked with a nav mesh. So our pathfinding method we'll set to Unity navigation, and the market root object already has a floor collider already marked out for us, and I'm going to place it on the nav mesh layer. I think I'll just remove that event trigger as well. And now if we run the scene, we've got our player pointing, clicking around, but you'll notice that the camera doesn't follow the player, so we're not going to be able to explore the scene until we fix that. So what we need to do is have a look at this game camera component while we're running the scene. Now the camera can be moved in all axes and rotate and pitch and spin and all the rest of it. At the moment they're all locked, and what we're going to do is uncheck these boxes while we're playing. So the spin rotation I'm going to unlock, and we now get to choose how it's affected by. And it mentions target X, which refers to the target's X position. And the target by default is the player, so we can change that here if we wanted. So I'm going to change the affected by to look at target, and I'll give it a height offset of, say, maybe 1.5. And now you can see that as the player walks around, the camera is always looking just above the player. But it doesn't follow, it doesn't actually move with the player, which the Unity adventure game does. So in our X-axis movement, let's uncheck lock. And now you can see it's following with the player, 1:1. And that's because the influence is 1. So let's change it to 0.5, and now it'll only move half as quickly. Finally, let's do the same for the Z-axis movement. I'll uncheck lock, but I'll change the affected by to target Z, but again, set the influence to 0.5. And now we've got pretty similar behavior as the Unity adventure game did. Now, because we've made these changes at runtime, we will just need to copy this component when we exit play mode, because it'll forget all of these. So to the top right of this game camera component, I'm going to click on that cog and choose copy component, exit play mode, and paste the component values. And that just makes all these changes we've made yet again. So we can run the scene, and we can now navigate around this market. So now that we've made it so that we can walk around both of our scenes individually, let's create a transition between them so that we can walk around the whole game without having to exit play mode and change the scene manually. Let's start from the security room scene, and we're going to do it using different methods for each transition. So from this scene, we're going to use a trigger. So we're going to make it so that when the player enters this doorway, the scene changes. And so we're going to use what's called a trigger. And we can create triggers in our scene manager. Down at the bottom, we've got a list of scene prefabs. And underneath the logic header, we've got the trigger prefab that we can double click to create a new one of. And if I select it in the hierarchy, we've got this red cube. And this red cube represents the boundary or the volume that will cause it to run when the player enters it. And it's a cube because it's got this box collider. Now we could remove this box collider and add any collider that we want, but a box is fine. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to position and stretch it out so that it covers this, this doorway here. And if I just open up the game window and check gizmos, I can see that we can reach this area with the mouse. I'll rename this trigger to exit room trigger. And we can see in its list of properties that it's already set to detect the player. So that's fine. And I should just make a special note that the player is only able to work with triggers because they have a rigid body and a collider attached. But that was added on using the character wizard. So back to this trigger, we now have an engine wait action, and everything here downwards will be our list of actions that will get run when the trigger is interacted with. And we only need one action for the moment, and that's going to be a scene switch action. Now we can choose whether or not our scene is referred to by number or name. I'm going to choose name, and the scene name is going to be market, because that's the name of our market scene file. And we can test that out quickly by entering play mode and clicking on the area there, and now suddenly we are in the scene. But there's a few things wrong. It would be nice to have a fade transition, but more importantly, we are not standing outside the door. So let's fix that now. I'll save the scene and go to the market scene. And I was talking before about this player start here being our default, really just for debugging purposes. But we want to make a new player start that will be referred to when we enter this scene from the security room scene. So again, in our scene manager and our list of prefabs, this time looking under the navigation header, we'll click player start to create a new one. And this player start represents where the player should be standing when they've come out of the security room. So I'm going to move this to this door here. I'll rename it player start from security room. And then we just need to configure it in its inspector. So I'll go to the inspector panel, and underneath the player start component, we've got previous scene that activates. And this is similar to the scene switch action. I'm going to set the choose scene by to name, and the previous scene is going to be security room. We now get fields for the camera on start and whether or not we want to fade in. We'll make a nice transition, so we'll check fade in on start. And the camera on start is going to be the same camera that we were using before, our default camera. Now the default camera in the scene manager is actually linked to the default player start. So each player start has its own camera. So here, in our player start from security room, I'm going to reassign that same navcam1 as its camera on start. Let's save the changes, go back to the security room. And now if I click on this floor here, we get a nice fade in, and she's standing outside of the door. Let's just add one more fade out before we enter this scene to make the transition complete. So I'm going to go back to the exit room trigger in this security room scene, and I'm going to add a new action. This is going to be a camera fade action. We're going to be fading in, but we want this fade in to occur before the scene switch. So I'm going to click on the cog and choose rearrange, move to top. And now it's positioned above the scene switch. And I'm then going to check wait until finish so that it completes before we switch scene. And when this is finished, we've got the after running field set to continue, which means it will then run this second action. So again, saving the scene and testing. I can click on the floor. Oh, I think I did the wrong. Yeah, I did a fade in instead. Let me fade out. I can click on the floor, it fades out, and we are in the new scene by the doorway. So now we just need to make the reverse so that we can enter in this security room from the market. And we're going to do this using a hotspot. And a hotspot is basically a clickable object. Now we're going to make this door area our hotspot. And in our game editor, again, the scene manager, underneath logic, we have a hotspot prefab. I'll double click it to create a new one. And I'm going to rename this to, say, hotspot door. And I will drag it and position it so that it covers the door. Like the trigger, this is nothing that we can see in the game window. It's just something that it represents a bounding volume. So as long as the mouse is over this area, then it will be interactive. And we can test how this looks actually by playing. If we mouse over, we've got hotspot door appearing above the cursor. So we don't actually want it to say hotspot door, which is the name of the game object. So if we view its inspector, we've got a label if not name field, and I'll enter in simply door. We want to run a second set of a camera fade out followed by a scene switch action. But instead of running from a trigger, we're going to run from a hotspot interaction. Underneath this Use Interactions panel, we've got a little plus to the right, and I'll click it to create a new interaction. We can then set the cursor, whether it's enabled or not, and we can assign a new interaction action list. So if I click on Create to automatically create one, we've now got a new action list in our hierarchy. I think I'll make this a child object of the hotspot, and you can see that this is very similar to the trigger action list that we made. We've got our actions listed here. I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to use the action list editor for this one. And we can access the action list editor either by clicking here in the inspector or by clicking on the node icon in the hierarchy. That's quite a big window, but we can dock it anywhere. I'll put it in the same space as the game window. And you can see our default action is listed here. So I'm going to change this to a camera fade action, setting the type to fade out, and again, I'll check wait until finish. Next, we'll make a new scene switch action, which we can do by dragging out a wire from this output socket and just releasing in empty space. This new action will be a scene switch. And again, we'll choose scene by name. This time the name will be security room. So if we run the scene and click on hotspot door, it fades out and we're now in the security room. Let's make the player now appear in the correct space in the security room. So loading back up the security room scene, we'll make one more player start. I'll name this player start from market, and I shall position it in front of the doorway, but making sure that it's not in the same space as the trigger, so that we don't end up automatically going straight back out again. Maybe about there. With its inspector, I'm going to say that this activates from the market scene. We have the same navcam1 camera, and we fade in on start. Let's test that now. We can click on the door, and we're here in the security room. We can click on here, and we're back out in the market. One final thing we want to do is make it so that the player first has to walk up to the door in order to go in. At the moment, it's just an instant transition. So if I reselect the hotspot door game object, you'll see in our Use Interaction panel, we've got a player action field, which is currently set to do nothing. And we can have him turn to face, walk to, or walk to a specific marker. I'm going to set this to walk to, which just means that it will walk to its general vicinity. We'll leave cutscene while moving off, which means we can still click away and cancel this interaction if we're still in the process of walking up to the door. But I'll set a minimum distance with a proximity of, I think about 1 unit seems about right. Let's try that. Click on the door, she then walks over, and when she gets within 1 unit, it then triggers the interaction. So now that we're able to walk around both of our scenes, there are a couple of immediate differences between this and the Unity tutorial on which this is based. The first is that there isn't any music, and the second is that we can double-click to make the player character run around. Now, this is AC's default behavior, but let's disable it just so that it's really the same as the original. We can make both of these changes within an action list that runs on the start, or when the game begins. Here in our Settings Manager, underneath Cutscene Settings, we have a field named ActionList on Start Game. And if I click to create and assign one, you'll see that we have a new asset within our project folder. I'm going to select this and drag it into our Unity Adventure Remake subfolder. Actually, I'm going to make a subfolder within that to store our action lists. Now, this is very similar to the trigger and interaction we made earlier, in that it is a series of actions. And if I double click on it, it will bring up the action list editor window, featuring the same default action of engine wait. So to disable the player's ability to run, we'll choose player and then constrain as the action type, and then set the walk run field to always walk. Next, we'll add in some music. So adding a new action, this one's going to be a sound play music action. And we haven't got any music loaded in at the moment, so we just have this error message and the music storage window button. And if I click on that, it gives us the ability to add as many music clips as we like, but we only need one because we only have one track. And this clip is going to be, let me find it, it is the background music asset file. And with that assigned, we're now able to select it here in the action as the music track. We're going to be playing it, and everything else can be left as is. So if we now run the game, you can see we now have music and we aren't able to run anymore. Actually, just so that I'm not shouting over it, I'm going to mute the audio until we come back to audio later on. Before we start building our game's logic and the puzzles and NPCs and so on, we're going to make it so that we already have an inventory to work with. We can define our inventory, that is the items that the player can pick up, here in the Inventory tab. Our first sub-tab here is Items, and in here we can create 4 new items. The first is going to be the coin, and after giving it a name, we also can assign it a main graphic. Inside our Sprites folder, I'm going to assign the coin sprite. The second item is going to be our coffee cup, and I'll assign the coffee graphic. The third is going to be our disguise, and I'll give it the glasses. And finally, we've got the red herring, which has texture red herring. Let's just see how this looks in game. I can test this out by clicking Carry on Start on, say, the first couple of these items, and then running the game. We can access the default inventory menu by hovering our mouse at the top of the screen. And you can see we've both got our coin and our coffee cup here. And when the mouse leaves the top, it then disappears. We can also click on any of these items that then become the cursor, ready for us to use on any hotspots in the scene. But that isn't the way the Unity finished adventure game works. Instead, this is just for display purposes. We can't actually interact directly with inventory items. Now we're going to restyle this menu later. For now, we're just going to make it so that the menu is always displayed and it's non-interactive. We're not able to select any of these items directly. We can do these things by going to the menu manager. Up at the top, we've got the menu tab, and inside the menus panel, we've got a list of all of the menus that make up our interface. If I click on inventory, it'll then give us all of the details about that inventory menu. Now our source is set to Unity UI prefab, which means we're also referring to an inventory UI, and the appear type is set to mouse over. Let's change that to during gameplay. We want this UI to be non-interactive, so I'm going to check ignore cursor clicks. But because we're also using Unity's event system to drive the handling of the UI, I'm also going to go to the inventory UI prefab and uncheck interactable. And that'll just mean that the event system doesn't do anything with it, even though AC is also not doing with it. And now if I run the scene, we've got our inventory displayed always up here. We can't interact with them. So let's finally go back to the inventory and uncheck carry on start for both of our test items. Let's now start building up our game logic and making our scenes interactive. I'm going to start again with the security room because that's the more simple of the two. And you can see we have three areas of interest. We've got this sign over here that gives us a clue as to how to solve the puzzle. We've got the security guard who will have different responses based on what we are carrying. And if we are carrying the coffee cup and the disguise, he's going to turn off these lasers, and when we then click on them, we will win the game. So let's start with the most simple, this sign over here. We're going to create another hotspot as we did with the door in the market. So I'm going to create a new hotspot from the scene manager and name it, say, hotspot sign. And again, we've got this yellow cube that I'm going to position over where we want the mouse to click on to make the player interact with it. I'll set the label to sign, and I'll create a new use interaction. Now we've got a cursor icon field here. It's currently set to use. We've got the options of talk to and look at, and these are the default verbs that are provided in the cursor manager. We can create more or take them away as we like. We're not actually making use of them at the moment, but if we were to later, say, have icons display, we'd want to set these up correctly. So just in case we do that later on, let's set the cursor icon to look at, just so we don't have to go back and do it later on. Let's create a new interaction, ActionList, and I'll make this a child of the hotspot sign just to make the hierarchy a little less cluttered. And if I click on the node icon, we bring up the action list for this interaction, and it's going to be a simple dialogue play speech action. It's going to be a player line. The player is going to say it, and they are going to say, he looks like a trustworthy fellow. But we also want the player to walk up to the middle of the sign pretty exactly and face the sign before they run that. So back to the hotspot component, we've got our player action, and let's set it to walk to marker. And walk to marker means that we will walk to somewhere specific, and we can define that marker up here with the walk to marker field. I click on create to automatically create and assign one, and it's placed at the middle of the hotspot, so I'll bring it down here to the floor, and it's similar to the player starts. It's this little green arrow that I can position and rotate, and I'll make it face the sign, because then if I go back to the hotspot, I'll check face after moving, so that when the player has walked towards the marker, she'll then face that direction before giving the line of dialogue. Let's now work on the lasers over here. So I'll make another hotspot. I'll call this one hotspot lasers. Stretched out like so. And I'll give it the label lasers. Again, with a use interaction, I'll set the player action to walk to, and I'll set the minimum distance to a proximity of 1. I'll create a new interaction for it, which I'll again make a child, and opening up the action list for that. The first action is going to be an object check visibility action, because what we're going to do is when the player talks to the guard with the correct items, he's going to turn off the lasers, and he's going to do that by having the visibility of this mesh disabled. So we can read the visibility of that mesh to determine if the player can go through them or not. So in the action list editor, we have an object check visibility action, and the object to check is going to be the security gate beams object. And we're going to be check that it's visible in the scene. That just means the enabled state of its mesh renderer. And if the condition is met, that is the top of these two output sockets, we're going to make it so that the player has won. So we'll choose a dialog play speech with the line text, "You win." But we won't check the player line, and we won't assign a speaker. And that means that the line will be a narration, which means that we can display it in a separate way, and it's not going to have any character animation associated with it. If the condition is not met, we're going to create another dialog play speech action. Again, it's going to be a narration, and the line text is going to be access denied. So we can actually test that out right now. We can go up to these lasers, and we have, oh, actually that's the wrong way around. Sorry, if the lasers are on, we're going to get an access denied error, and if the lasers are off, then we've won the game. So let's try that again. So here, access is denied, and let me just manually disable the mesh renderer for the lasers, and we get this "you win" statement. And I think we can go one step further. We can actually make the game exit when we've won. So after the "you win" speech, I'm going to create a new action, which is going to be an engine end game, and the command is going to be quit game. So if I disable the mesh renderer at runtime, click on these lasers, the game then ends automatically. Now let's work on the guard. Now the guard is present in the hierarchy, and we're going to make him another character. Just as we did with the player, we're going to use the character wizard. So adventure creator, editors, character wizard, and I'll dock it to the right here. Choose next. Is this a player or an NPC? I'll choose NPC. The character's name, let's call him Steve. And the game object is going to be this guard game object. He is going to be animated with mechanim, although technically we're not going to be actually changing any of his parameters. Finish and close. And you can see, as with the player, he's now got a collider and a rigid body. And he's also got a hotspot component. And finally, an NPC component, which is similar to the player inspector. You can see that he also has a move speed float and an is talking talkable. If we open up his controller, he's actually just playing one animation. He doesn't have any parameters. So I'm going to remove both of these parameter names from his NPC inspector. I'm going to remove his rigid body, just so that he doesn't interfere with any of our scene physics or anything. And his collider, I'll check is trigger. Finally, in order to make something interactive or make something clickable with hotspots, it needs to be on the default layer. So I'm going to set his layer from characters to default. And incidentally, we can change what the interactive layer is here in our settings manager, but by default it's the default for hotspot layer. So let's just test we've got that. So now the guard is interactive. Let's give him some actions. So in his hotspot component, I'll create a new use interaction. The cursor icon this time is going to be talk to. The player action will be walk to, and we'll make her face after moving. With a set minimum distance of 1. And the interaction, guard talk to. Well, before we start creating the actions, let's just think for a moment about what we want. So according to whether or not the player is carrying the coffee cup and the disguise, he will be saying different things. So first we want to check if we've got the disguise, because if we don't have the disguise, he's going to tell us to go away. So our first action is going to be an inventory check action. We're going to be checking if we're carrying a specific item, and that item is going to be the disguise. And if we're not carrying the item, we want him to tell us to get lost. So if condition is not met, we're going to set to, well, I'll just drag out that bottom socket there. We're going to make this a dialog play speech action. The guard is going to be the speaker, and the line text is simply going to be get lost. Now, if the condition is met, we're going to have him then make another check, because he's recognized us as this Frank. But if we're not carrying the coffee cup, he'll tell us to go and get one. Otherwise, he'll open the lasers. So, or turn off the lasers rather. So we're going to make another inventory check action. This time we're going to check if we're carrying the coffee cup. If we are not carrying the coffee cup, he's going to say this time, say something like, hey Frank, you need to get some coffee first. If the condition is met, then he's going to be able to turn off the lasers. So we'll make a new action that is going to be one more dialogue please speech, and he'll say, "Hey Frank, go on through." Actually, I forgot to assign the speaker fields for these two actions. So now he'll be able to say these. And after telling us we can go on through, he'll disable the lasers. So this will be an object visibility. The object to affect, again, will be the security gate beams, and the visibility will be set to invisible. And we'll be doing this because, again, in our hotspot lasers, we're doing an object check visibility action to determine whether or not we can go through them. We're going to make them invisible, and then if they are invisible, we can go through them. So let's test this out. If we just click on him right off, we get lost. Now let's add the disguise to our inventory by selecting it in the inventory manager and checking carry on start. So he'll tell us about that. And if I now also add the coffee cup to our inventory, he'll turn off the lasers and we can go through them. So now I'll take these items away from us again because we'll be adding them in the other scene. Let's now work on the market scene. So we have this vending machine where we can pick up this coin. We have a fish that we can pick up. We've got a coffee machine that if we're carrying the coin, then we'll get a coffee cup. And we have this bird that if we try to interact with it, it'll fly up and knock down the glasses, and we can then pick the glasses up. So let's work our way across the scene, starting with this coin. Now, if I select the coin and then go to the AC scene editor, select the hotspot, we'll get an option named Position Over Selected Mesh. And if I check that, then what it'll do is it'll create this new hotspot and it'll try to resize it automatically to fit the coin. I'll make it a little bit bigger just so that the click area isn't so small, and I'll name this hotspot coin, giving it the label coin, and the use interaction is going to be use. The interaction action list will create, and I'll give it a player action of walk to marker because we're going to be having the player crouch down and pick it up. We want them to be in a specific spot, so we'll be using walk to marker. I'll create the walk to marker like so, and then position it and rotate it like that. And then the coin action list, I'll make that a child of the hotspot. What's going to happen is the player is going to play an animation. The hotspot is going to be deactivated because the coin will be picked up. We're going to hide the coin mesh, and we're going to add the coin inventory item to our inventory. So we're going to start with a character animate action. This is going to be the player we're animating, so I'll check is player, and it's detected that this is an animator or a mechanism based player, so the options that follow are now suited to mechanism. So the method is going to be change parameter value, because what we're going to be doing is, if I can open up the player's click to move animator controller, we're going to play the player take item medium animation, and that is run when the med take parameter, that's a trigger parameter, is run. So we're going to be affecting the medTake parameter. The parameter type is going to be a trigger. Next, we're going to have a engine wait of, say, half a second. That's just so that it's not all instant. It waits a little bit before anything else occurs. We'll follow it up with a dialogue play speech, and the player line will be, "Oh, a coin." Next, we will turn off the hotspot. So we'll make a hotspot enable or disable action. The hotspot to effect is going to be our coin, and the change to make will be disable. We're going to make the coin mesh invisible. So we'll have an object visibility action, making the object to affect the coin and the visibility as invisible. And then an inventory add or remove action where we'll be adding the coin item. And finally, we'll have another engine wait action of about half a second, just so that the picking up animation can complete. So I can click on the coin, she goes and picks it up, and we have it added to our inventory, and the coin is no longer there in the scene to be interacted with. Let's go do something similar with the red herring here. So the fish are actually all one model, so we're not going to be able to make it invisible when we click on it, but we can make a hotspot. I'll choose position over selected mesh and then reshape the hotspot to just this fish. I'll rename this hotspot fish. I'll give it the label fish, and the use interaction, again, we'll have a walk to marker, create that marker, and then work on the interaction action list. And we're going to be playing a different animation this time. So this will be another character animate where isPlayer is checked. The method will be change parameter value, but this time we'll be playing the player take item high animation, which means that we need to invoke the high take trigger. So the parameter to effect is going to be high take. The type is going to be trigger. We'll wait another half a second, and then the player will say some more. So this will be another dialogue play speech, and the line text will be, "I doubt this is useful." We'll add the fish to our inventory with an inventory add or remove action. The item to add will be our red herring, and we'll follow it up with a final hotspot enable or disable action. The hotspot to effect will be the hotspot fish. The change to make will be disable, and maybe one more half a second wait for the animation to complete. Oh, I've got one more thing. In the fish hotspot, I'm going to check face after moving. Let's now go and work on this coffee bot. Now the coffee bot is able to speak. He has a line or a couple of lines. So we're going to make him an NPC as well. If I open up the market game object, we've got this coffee bot here. Instead of using the character wizard, I think I'll just add components manually. So I'll choose add component, and we want a box collider with is trigger checked, and I'll raise up the boundary of the robot here. This is the clickable area. Place him on the default layer, and I'm going to add the component NPC and the hotspot component. Go back to the NPC for a moment. I'm going to change the animation engine to Mechanim and remove the Mechanim parameter fields because we're not going to be doing any special animation for him. He's just going to be playing the same thing. And in the hotspot component, I'm going to give him the name CoffeeBot, and I'll write the same thing actually in the speaker label of his NPC component. I'll create a new use interaction, and this will be a player action. And the player action, let's just make it walk to, face after moving, set minimum distance of 1. I'll create a new use interaction action list. Now, if the player is carrying a coin, then the coffee bot will give us a coffee, and we'll pay for it with the coin. If we're not carrying a coin, he'll just tell us we can buy coffee with a coin. So in our action list for the coffee bot's use interaction, we're going to have, again, an inventory check action list. The check to make is if we're carrying a coin, and if we aren't, it'll be a dialogue play speech. The speaker will be CoffeeBot, and the line text will be coffee, only 1 coin. If the condition is met for this inventory check, that is, if we are carrying the coin, we're going to have the CoffeeBot say, here's your coffee. We'll add another character animate action where we're going to animate the player, and the parameter to effect is going to be med take again. Parameter type is going to be trigger, and we're going to wait for half a second. Then what we're going to do is we're going to replace our coin with our coffee. So we're going to use an inventory add or remove action, but this time the method is going to be replace. We will be adding the coffee cup, and we will be removing the coin. And we could do this with an add and then a remove action, so 2 actions, but this will also mean that the coffee cup is in the same inventory slot as the coin. Let's run that and see how it works. Oh, I forgot to put a face action there as well. I'll remedy that in a minute. So we have the coin, and we get the coffee. Let's actually change a couple of things. First, I'll go back to our hotspot coin, and I'll check face after moving. And also in our CoffeeBot use action list, I'm going to check play in background for the here's your coffee line. And that means that the action list will continue as soon as this action is run. It's not going to wait for this line to finish. So hopefully it'll make it feel a bit more natural. So now if I go and click on the coffee bot, there we go. We've played the animation and the speech at the same time. Finally, let's work on our bird and disguise hotspot. We have our bird and our disguise actually is all one big cutscene, and what happens is a single animation handles the bird flying away and the glasses dropping down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create hotspots that actually are child objects of both of these, so that they're always in the correct position because they'll be moving as part of the cutscene. So we'll start with the bird here, and if I expand bird glasses cutscene and I find the bird mesh, go back to the scene window, the scene prefabs with hotspot selected, again I'll choose position over selected mesh, and I can actually enter the name of it in here. I'll call this hotspot bird, add new, and I'll parent this to my bird mesh. I'll name this bird. I'll create a new use interaction where the player action is going to be walk to, face after moving, set minimum distance, and I'll make this a bit tighter, maybe set the proximity to 0.7. I'll create a new interaction action list, and this again is going to have a character animate where we animate the player, but this time we're going to be running player taken item attempt, which requires the attempt take parameter. So the parameter to effect is going to be attempt take. This is going to be a trigger parameter. We'll wait half a second, and then what we want to do is trigger this bird glasses cutscene. So if I double click on this, we can see we've got this fly away animation that runs when we enable the fly away trigger. So the new action is going to be an object animate because the bird is not an NPC. The animation engine is going to be Mechanim, and this is similar to the player except we have to actually choose the animator we want to affect. So we're going to be affecting the bird glasses cutscene. The parameter is going to be fly away. Again, this is a trigger parameter. And then we'll wait a few seconds while the bird knocks this down, and then our player character will say something. So we'll wait, say, 2.5 seconds, and then have dialogue, play speech action, and the player line is, wow, that bird knocked down those glasses. So let's see how that runs. And here are our glasses on the floor. So let's make these glasses a hotspot now. So in the same way, I'm going to find the glasses mesh, and in the scene manager, I can check position over selected mesh for my new hotspot, which is going to be hotspot glasses. I'll create that, and again, I'll parent this to the glasses mesh so that when it falls down, so does this hotspot. I'll make the label, if not name, glasses, add a new use interaction, walk to, face after moving, set minimum distance. I'll make this more tight, 0.5. I'll create a new interaction action list. Now the use action list of the hotspot glasses is where things get a little bit more complicated, because we're going to have the player equip the disguise on their mesh. Let's get everything else out the way first. So we're going to have the player pick them up, and to pick up the glasses, we're going to play a specific animation. In our animations or animators player, we've got click to move, and we want to be playing the player put glasses on animation. And to do that, we're going to be triggering the low take and the equip glasses parameters. So we'll start off with 2 character animate actions, one for low take, which will be a trigger, and another for equip glasses. We'll wait another maybe half second, follow it up with a dialogue play speech where the player simply says, "Oh, some glasses." And we will disable the glasses hotspot as well as make this, this mesh invisible. So we'll go to the back to the action list, choose hotspot, enable or disable. The hotspot to effect will be the hotspot glasses, changing it to disable, and we'll make it invisible with an object visibility action, setting the object to effect as the glasses mesh with the visibility set to invisible. We'll then add the glasses or the disguise to our inventory. So I'll add an inventory add or remove action where we will be adding the disguise item. And next we want to have the player visually equip the glasses. Now we can find the player prefab inside our Unity Adventure Remake. If I drag her into the scene and expand her hierarchy, you'll see that we have skeleton, hips, spine 1, spine 2, neck, head, and finally we come to disguise, which is a disabled game object. And if I enable it, you can see the disguise on her head. So what's happening in the Unity tutorial is they're enabling this game object at runtime. We're going to do something slightly different. We're going to have this object enabled, but the mesh renderer disabled. And that'll mean that we can use the object visibility action to show it when we want. Now, the complication with this comes from the fact that we want the action to refer to the prefab and not the scene object. But Unity doesn't let us affect prefabs more than one chain down in their hierarchy. So we're going to have to use what's called a constant ID to refer to this prefab object. Now that sounds a little bit complicated, but let me demonstrate and hopefully it'll make more sense. So in order to access this as a constant ID number, we're going to use an ActionList asset instead of this scene-based interaction that we've been working with so far. So I'm going to go to my ActionList subfolder and create a new Adventure Creator action list, and I'll call this Show Disguise. I'll expand that by double-click on it to show the ActionList editor, and this will be just a simple single object visibility action, just as we've been doing before, and the object to effect will be the disguise. Now notice I'm using the scene instance of this prefab, dragging it into the field. And because an asset is being asked to refer to a scene object, it's automatically assigned a constant ID component to that object. And with that component, it's generated a number. And so, although we have the object to effect field assigned, it's also showing that number. And so when this action runs, it will look for an object that has this number in the scene and use that instead. So we want to make sure that this ID number is always on this object. We're going to be removing it in a moment from the scene. So I'll check retain in prefab and then click apply to apply the changes back to the player prefab and then remove her from the scene. So if we go back to the ActionList editor, you can see that the object to effect is now blank because we were referring to a scene object, but the constant ID number is still there. So now all we need to do is have this ActionList asset run as part of the use interaction. So going back to the hotspot glasses use, we'll scroll down to the bottom and add a new action, which will be an ActionList run action. This will have a source of asset file because we're going to be running an ActionList asset, and we'll set that asset as show disguise. So now when we click on the disguise, it'll run that asset. Well, let's get there first. Click on the bird, knock down the glasses, and when we run the interaction, she'll then be wearing the glasses. Now you can tweak the timing of that a little bit. It probably wasn't quite perfect, but you can see the gist is there. We have the item in our inventory and she's equipping it on her actual prefab. Finally, we just want to make it so that we can't pick up the glasses while they're up at the top here. Now there are a couple of ways we could do it. We could just disable the hotspot glasses to begin with, and we can do that by adding a remember hotspot component and setting the hotspot state on start to off. Another way we could do it is to use variables to make it interactive, but have the player say, I can't reach it. So let's do that instead. I'll remove this component, and we're going to use a Boolean variable to determine if the glasses are on the floor or not. So in the game editor, we'll choose the Variables tab to open the Variables Manager, and we have a choice of either global and local variables. Global are variables that any scene can access or ActionList can access. We don't need that here, we only need local, which is for this scene only. So we'll create a new local variable. We'll name it can reach glasses. Its type we'll leave as Boolean, which is just true or false, on or off. The initial value will be false. And then we'll incorporate that into our hotspot glasses action list. So I'll select it here, and I'll create a new action by right-clicking in some empty space with a variable check action, where the source is going to be local, and we've only got one variable, so it's already come up, can reach glasses, and it's going to compare with the value true. Let's make this the very first action, so I'll click the cog and choose move to front. I can auto arrange to have everything shunted down. Then if the condition is met, then we want the action list to play as it always did. Otherwise, we're going to have it play a dialog play speech action. It's going to be a player line, and she'll simply say, I can't reach those from here. Finally, we need to have this Boolean change to true when we've knocked the glasses down. So we do that in our bird use action list. This is when we knock the glasses down in the first place. So after disabling the bird hotspot, we're going to have a variable set action list where we will set the local variable can reach glasses to the value true. So now we can walk over to the glasses. We can try to pick them up, but we can't reach them. So we'll knock them down with the bird. And now we can get them. This next section is going to be optional, but it is going to demonstrate a useful feature of AC, and that is the use of ActionList parameters that allow us to change actions at runtime, which we can then use to recycle actions that are commonly used throughout the game. So when we were building these interactions for this market scene, we found that we were using the character animate action quite a lot, followed by a short pause with an engine wait action. So what we're going to do is we're going to place those two actions in a separate action list and call that whenever we want to animate the character. Now we can do this either from a scene-based action list such as a cutscene, but I'm going to do it from an action list asset so that we could call this whenever we like in any scene. So I'll create a new Adventure Creator action list and I'll name it Trigger Player Anim. And if I open it up, as before, we'll have a character animate action where the player is going to be animated. The method is change parameter value. The parameter type is trigger, but I'm not going to enter in a parameter to effect. I'm then going to add an engine wait action, and I'm not going to set a wait time. What instead I'm going to do is click on Show Properties, and this then shows the same properties that we can get from the top of the inspector, and I'll check Use Parameters. And that'll create this new panel underneath where I can create two parameters. The first I'm going to call trigger parameter, and the type is going to be a string. And the next parameter I'm going to name time to wait, and that's going to be a float. If I then click on Show Actions to take me back to this node view, you'll see that these actions have now been altered. With the character animate action, our parameter effect now has a field to set the trigger parameter that we've just created. And the engine wait allows us to set the time to wait parameter as our wait time. And that means that when this action list is run, those parameters will be used in place of those fields. And we can set those parameter values each time we run it. So let's start with the coin. We've got our coin use interaction, and we have our character animate action. So I'm going to remove both of these and replace them with an action list run, where the source is set to asset file and the action list asset is trigger player anim. And you can see we can now set the two parameters that we defined. So our time to wait is going to be 0.5. The parameter to effect is going to be med take. And I'll check wait until finish so that the wait action completes before anything else is run. I can then make this move to the front and remove these two actions so that we then go directly from the action list run to the play speech. And we can do this for all of the times. In fact, actually, if I copy this first, we can do this for all of the moments that the player is animated. So we have another one here. Instead of triggering med take, I'm going to trigger high take. I'll make this the first one. and I'll remove the old ones. Now obviously if I was doing this, if I wasn't doing this as part of a tutorial, I'd probably make this action list to begin with, so I wouldn't then have to go and change these action lists. But this is just demonstrating how you can use it. Same for the coffee bot. I can now remove these actions. And so you can see we're now recycling these actions. And so if we wanted to change what was going on when we trigger a player animation, for example, if we wanted to play a sound or something like that, we could then just add in whatever action we wanted on top of this, and that would be run every time we animate the player. With the game logic complete, we're now free to start adding a bit more polish. So let's add some sounds. Now we've already got the music going, so let's go and add some ambient sounds. Now in our audio clips ambient folders, we've got market ambient and security ambient. So let's have both of these loaded in as ambient sounds. And this is similar to the music system in that we can use a dedicated action for this. But this action is going to run when this scene begins. So in our game editor, we've got our list of scene cutscenes, and where it says on start, I'm going to create a new one. And this on start cutscene is going to run whenever we enter this scene through natural gameplay, or if we start the game from this scene. This is going to have a sound play ambience action. And as with the music action, we have the option to open up a dedicated window where we can add our ambience clips. So I'll add two clips. The first is going to be our market ambient, the second the security ambient. I'll close it, and now we have access to both of these in the ambience track field. We're going to be playing the security room ambient sound. We're going to be looping it, and that's all we need to do for this. Let's do the same thing in the market. We'll open up the market scene, create a new on start cutscene, and this will have its own sound play ambience action. We'll be setting the ambience track to market ambient, and we'll be looping it. And we should now find that it switches between them when we change scene. Let's add, to complete this transition, let's add some sound effects to this door. So to play a regular sound effect, we're going to add a sound object into our scene. And I'll name this door sound. And if we view its inspector, we can see that it's got a sound component which we can use to choose what sound type it is, and this controls the volume and so on. The audio source component is just a Unity standard, and we're going to set the audio clip to door slide. And what we'll now do is have this sound play when we use the door. So I'll go to the hotspot door, expand it to find its door use interaction. I'll add a new action. I'll make this the front. I'll make this a sound play action. Connect it to our camera fade. And the sound we're going to be playing is going to be the door sound. We're not going to be changing the clip because we've already assigned it in our door sound inspector. And actually it takes a little bit longer than the camera fade which means that it actually gets cut off when we change the scene. So what I'm going to do is just add another engine wait of maybe a quarter of a second, 0.25. Save the scene, and we'll do the same thing in the security room. So I'll add made two of them. I'll add a door sound object. The audio clip is going to be door slide. And this time we'll be running it from the trigger. So we have our exit room trigger. The actions are overlapping here because until now we've been working with the inspector. So we can automatically arrange these just by clicking up here, and now they're arranged neatly. So I'll add another new action, make this the start, and I will make this another sound play that plays the door sound, then the camera fade, then a new brief quarter of a second engine wait, followed by our scene switch. And the other sound effects are essentially done in much the same way. Now, as for speech audio, we don't want to be creating different sound objects for each voiceover clip and then running those as part of our action lists. Instead, what we want to do is attach a voiceover clip to each dialogue play speech action, such as these ones we have here in our guard talk to interaction. But we don't assign them within the action itself. What we first do is gather up our game's speech and then link those within the speech manager. So in the speech tab here in the AC game editor, down at the bottom we've got a panel for our game text, which is currently empty, but if I click on gather text, we'll then be prompted to back up and save the scene, because AC then goes through all of the scenes in our build settings and searches for any text that can be either translated or given speech audio to. Now we can show all of those by changing the type filter to speech, and the scene filter, let's choose any or no scene. And now we can see all of the dialogue that we've created. If we expand it, we get more information about it. We know who is speaking, the scene in which it's in, and we also get an audio path and file name. And that is because by default, speech audio is played by file name convention. It's pulled automatically from a resources folder or a speech subfolder within our resources, and it looks for a file name that's given here. But we've already got all of our audio clip voiceover sounds in each of these three subfolders. So instead of having to rename them, what we're going to do is manually attach them to each of these text boxes. So I'll uncheck auto name speech audio files, and that'll mean that we can then manually assign an audio clip to each line. So we have this get lost line from the guard. Guard get lost. Hey Frank, get some coffee first. Go get coffee. Frank, go on through. Guard, go through. Next is he looks like a trustworthy fellow. That was from the player. You win. This is actually a narration line. Now I suppose it doesn't really matter. We could either do this as a regular effects sound, but we could also assign it as speech audio. So you win. Access denied. Oh, some glasses is from the player. That was player pick up glasses. We don't actually have a sound for I can't reach those from here because this is an interaction we added ourselves. Coffee, only 1 coin. That was from the coffee bot. Here's your coffee. Oh, a coin. That was another player. Pick up coin. Wow, the bird knocked down those glasses. That is player bird knocked sign. And finally, I doubt this is useful. That was pick up fish. One final thing is that now that we have speech audio, it's removing the subtitles, because by default subtitles are only shown if a line doesn't have any associated audio. We can change that very easily within the settings manager. We'll go down to the bottom and enable show subtitles. Another way we could do it is to go into the menu manager, find the subtitles menu, and check ignore subtitles option. So our game is now getting pretty close to matching the Unity adventure tutorial. The main thing that's now different is the UI. Now you can see we've got this menu button down here that if we click takes us to the pause menu. We've got a label that appears above the cursor whenever we mouse over a hotspot. We've got this inventory bar up at the top instead of being on the side. And when we talk to a character, their words appear, their speech appears in a black box at the bottom. So let's go through each of those in turn. The menu down at the bottom left is the in-game menu, and that's part of the default AC interface. We can find it in the menu manager, and under our list of menus we have our in-game menu. So if we want to disable it, we can do so just by clicking Start Game Locked Off in its properties. We could also delete it, but this way we can bring it back if we later change our mind. The hotspot menu is what shows the label when we hover over a hotspot or an inventory item. And you can see it has one element inside it, that being the actual label. The menu is like the container for it, and the label is the actual text that it shows. And if we click on that, we can see that the label type is set to hotspot, which means it'll show the name of whatever hotspot we're hovering over. So let's just restyle it. We're not going to change the functionality at all. We've got our linked canvas prefab here, hotspot UI, and it's a UI prefab because our source field is set to Unity UI prefab, and that means this UI contains this label and is changed dynamically by AC at runtime. So I'll just drag the hotspot UI canvas into the scene, go into 2D mode, and don't know why it's all white here. Zoom in enough, and then we've got our label here, the text hotspot. So I'm just going to restyle this to make it look a little bit more like the rest of the Unity tutorial interface. I'm going to set the font to GeoRegular. Actually, I can do this in the game window. Make it a little bit bigger. I suppose that's about all we need to do, really. I'll click Apply to send the changes back to the prefab and remove it from the scene. So let's just see how we're doing. Okay, this is gone, and we have our guard. Actually, what I'll do is I'll position this down at the bottom here. I'll place the hotspot UI back, and in the game editor, I'm going to go back to our hotspot menu, and we have a position type field, which at the moment is set to follow cursor. So I'm going to change it to manual, which means it won't be controlled by AC, it'll be controlled by the canvas itself. So at the moment, it's set down it's set to the middle of the screen here. I'm just going to move its parent down to the bottom like so. Again, I'll apply it and remove it from the scene. Next, let's work on our subtitles menu. And what we're going to do is actually make use of the message canvas prefab that is already in our project. Now, this was used by the Unity Adventure tutorial. So if we just drag this into the scene, and so we want this new text to be replaced by the character's speech text. So first of all, I'm going to remove the text manager script component from the root. Now, there aren't any custom scripts on the message text prefab. So we'll go into the game editor and choose subtitles. And what we're going to do is we're going to delete this one and create a new one. So I'll choose Create New Menu. I'll give it the name Subtitles. The source is going to be Unity UI prefab. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a new prefab before I do anything else. So I've got my message canvas, and I'll rename it to Subtitles New. And drag it in to my UI folder. And then I'll drag that into the linked canvas field in my menu manager. I'm then going to set the appear type to when speech plays. Now we have some extra options for what kind of characters it shows for, but I'm going to ignore those, but check Ignore Subtitles option so that it displays even if we have audio attached to the speech. Going a little bit further down, we've got our list of elements, and this is a text or a label, so we're going to create a new label element, and this is going to be our speech text. So I'll name this label speech text label, and I'll set the label type to dialog line. Finally, we need to link our message text box to the linked text field. Now, we can access this field from within the hierarchy in the prefab here, but very often we won't be able to do that because, again, Unity doesn't allow for accessing child objects more than one level deep in prefabs. So what we're going to do instead is, just to demonstrate how you would normally do this, we will drag the scene object message text into the field, and similar to how the ActionList asset affects the player's child object, it then records a constant ID number that is then added to the message text game object. And that's indicated by this save icon here. So we can then apply the changes to the prefab, delete the scene object, and now when we run the scene, we'll have our speech text display at the bottom. There's a couple of more things we can do to improve its appearance. First of all, let's disable the scrolling. We can do that back in the speech manager, and underneath the subtitles panel, we'll uncheck Scroll Speech Text. We also want to make it so that the speech text changes color depending on which character is speaking. We can do that back in the menu manager. And for this speech text label element, we'll check Use Character Text Color. And now we just need to assign a color for each character. So, for example, we've got this guard here, and if I view his NPC inspector, we've got a speech text color, so let's change it to red. Finally, we'll work on the inventory menu. Now, if I save this scene and go into the persistent scene, we've got these inventory boxes as part of the persistent canvas. That is part of the Unity adventure tutorial. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of recycle this for our own needs. So I'm going to name this inventory UI new. We can remove the fade image because that's not part of this. We have a vertical layout group, which means that all of these are arranged in a grid. And if we open up our item slots, we have a background image and an item image for each. So what I'm going to do for all 4 of these item image objects is re-enable the image component and then add a button component. And that's necessary for AC to be able to connect to them, even if the buttons themselves aren't going to be clickable. So back in the AC game editor, we'll find the inventory menu, and I think what we'll do is we'll adapt this one instead of scrapping it and remaking a new one. So you can see we've got a UI prefab that's currently linked to inventory UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this inventory UI new a new prefab in my UI folder, and I'll connect it to that one instead. We've got a transition type of canvas group fade, and for that we need to have a canvas group component on the root, but we're not going to have any fading, so we'll just turn that off. We have a rect transform boundary field, and that basically means a rect transform that tells AC where the boundary of the UI lies, and that's used for things like checking if the mouse is over it and so on. I'll just assign the inventory child component there. Again, we're adding on ID numbers, constant ID numbers as we're doing this, so when we're finished we're going to have to make sure to apply the changes back to the prefab. In its list of elements we have shift left. This is a button to scroll through our inventory. Same for shift right, but we only have 4 items and 4 slots, so we're not going to need those. So we can delete those 2. And if we click on the inventory box, you'll see we're able to connect. At the moment we've got 13 slots, and so we've got 13 button fields. We've only got 4 slots, so I'll reduce this down to 4. And you can see, because this is working currently with another UI canvas, we've got these pre-existing constant IDs. So what we're going to be doing is reassigning these buttons so that the constant ID numbers are changed. So I'll get item image for the first button, and it's generated a new number there. Same for the second, same for the third, and for the fourth. And again, these ID numbers are AC's way of keeping track of objects between assets and scene files, so that we can remove this from the scene and it'll still be able to find it once it's spawned back into the scene. So back into the inspector for inventory UI new, I'll click apply to save those changes, and we're not going to be using this scene anyway, so I'll just open up, say, the market scene. And we have our inventory listed here, and we'll see our items collected to them as we go through the game. Now this does disappear while we are in a cutscene, so let's just tweak that now. In the menu manager, we'll find the inventory menu again, and we've got this appear type setting, which is currently set to during gameplay. Let's just change it to except when paused. And that will mean that it only gets hidden away when we open up the pause menus. There was actually one thing I did forget to do, and that is we need to prevent the UI canvas from being interactable. So if we go back to our inventory UI new game object, you can see that we don't have a canvas group like we did earlier on the inventory UI. And if you remember earlier, we unchecked interactable on that canvas group. So let's do the same thing for this one. I'm going to add the component canvas group, and I'll uncheck interactable. And that'll just mean that we can't mouse over the inventory in any way. Just because it's a key element of many adventure games, let's go and add a simple conversation to this game. Let's make it so that we can talk to the coffee bot and actually ask him from a series of options for a cup of coffee. Let's start by creating the conversation object, which we can do in the scene manager. Underneath logic, we've got this conversation prefab, and I'll rename it coffee bot conversation. And viewing its inspector, we can let's just add a couple of dialog options, and we'll give them some labels. The first one will be, can I get a coffee? And the second one will be simply goodbye. Now, we also have some options for icon textures and what happens when finished, but this is actually kind of a legacy feature of AC, and instead of running different action lists when we click on one of these options in game, we can actually have all of our actions within the same action list. So to demonstrate that, let's go back to our CoffeeBot use interaction and create a new action. This one is going to be a dialog start conversation action. Let's move this to the very front, move to front, and I can auto arrange to declutter everything. And the conversation is going to be our new CoffeeBot conversation. I'll then check override options so that we can control what happens when we click on each of them right here in this action list. So again, auto arrange to push these down. And we want these actions, the original ones, to only run if we choose the option, can I get a coffee? So drag a wire from the top socket down to our first inventory check action. And goodbye is just going to have the player say that line. So that'll be a dialogue play speech action, a player line, and the line text will be goodbye. Auto arranging again. And let's see how that runs. So you can see now we have our two options. I can choose goodbye, or I can choose can I get a coffee? Actually, let's just add one more action in there, just so the player can actually say that. So we have can I get a coffee? I'm going to create a new dialogue play speech action of can I get a coffee? And just insert that in between the two. Oh, we're also getting an error message about the CoffeeBot has no audio source. Let's try to amend that. CoffeeBot, add component, audio source. Let's also restyle the UI as well. In the AC Game Editor, we'll go back to the menu manager, and our conversations are coming through from the conversation menu. The linked canvas is this conversation UI, which if I drag in here, you can see it has these four options plus this timer bar here, which is used if we want to have, say, timed conversations, so you have a limited time to choose an option. We're not going to be using that in this game, so I can delete the slider timer from the UI prefab. And if I expand the grid, I can get all of my text options. So I'm just going to try to restyle these a little better in line with the rest of it. I'll change the font to GeoRegular, raise the font size a little bit, and I'll hide this image panel like so. I'll also add an outline to each of these dialog options. I can apply changes back to the UI, and because I removed the timer from the UI, I'll also remove it from my list of elements. Actually, before we say that this section is done, there are a couple more things I want to just quickly look at. The first is quite simple. I just want to make it so that when we've chosen the first option, regardless of what the response is from the coffee bot, we'll go back to the conversation. So we'll have the choices again. So in our coffee bot use interaction, we want to make it so that when we choose, can I get a coffee, we loop back onto this dialog start conversation action. So if we follow the nodes down, we'll end up either with this coffee only one coin speech action or the inventory add or remove action. So for both of these, I'm going to loop these back onto the dialog start conversation. Now they are a bit out of the way. I could I suppose move this up and try to sort of loop back onto that like so. This one all the way down here, I'm not going to be able to do that, but I can still change the after running field to skip and then change the action to skip to 0, the dialog start conversation action. And if I want to get rid of these blue lines, I can go to the cog and check toggle output sockets. And that just hides the blue line from view. But we can still see where it goes by looking at this after running field. Now I also think this would be a good chance to demonstrate how we can switch cameras during game. Now I know none of this happens with the Unity tutorial, but I think it's a good opportunity. So let's create a new camera from our scene manager. We have a list of different camera types we have. I'm just going to choose simple camera for this one because we're not going to be moving the camera. A simple camera doesn't give us any movement options, so we don't have very many options here. And what I'm going to do is drag this so that we're looking at the coffee bot from an angle, hopefully so that the player will get in the camera as well. Actually, I'll name this camera Coffee Bot Camera. And then going back to the Coffee Bot Use action list, I'm going to add a new action that's going to eventually be the first action. I'll change it to a camera switch, move to front, shunt everything down with auto arrange, and the new camera field is going to be this Coffee Bot camera. And let's set the transition time to maybe 2 seconds. And once we set it to anything above 0, we get more options so far as how it's animated. I'm just going to keep things simple. I'll choose smooth. If we wanted to be really picky, we could use a custom curve, but I'll just leave it like that. And then finally, we'll need to switch back to our gameplay camera. That's our navcam1 when we've finished the conversation. So that's done when we choose goodbye. So I'm going to create another camera switch. And just for convenience, I can check return to last gameplay to go to the navcam1 automatically. And I'll leave the transition time as 0 just so that we can demonstrate a snap cut. So I can walk over and talk to our coffee bot here. We get our 2 options. And if I choose the first one, we'll get a response, but then we will be given these options yet again. We're just about finished with our game here, but the last thing we need to do is quite important, and that is to enable it for saving. Now, AC will save everything that it knows that it has to automatically, and I can demonstrate that here by running the game from this market scene. I'll save the game just right off the top, and I'll pick up this coin over here. And then if I walk over to the right here, and then save my game again, I'll load back to my first game, and you can see the player is in the correct position. The camera was not, so it had to adjust itself to focus again on the player. The inventory is correctly removed from the inventory bar, but the coin hotspot is not re-enabled. So we need to tell AC that we want to save the enabled state of that hotspot. And we can do that by adding the remember hotspot component. So if I select this hotspot coin here, and I choose add component, adventure creator, save system, you can see that we have a whole bunch of remember scripts, each one saving a different aspect of the game object data. So I'll add remember hotspot, and that then flags it up to be saved. Now we want to do the same thing for all of our game objects. For example, these glasses over here, we'll want to save the visibility of the actual mesh. But rather than going and doing all of that manually, we can go up to the Settings Manager and click on Auto Add Save Components to Game Objects. It'll ask us to back it up and save first, but basically what it'll then do is it will try to go through and identify anything that needs saving and attach the correct component. So let's click on these hotspot glasses here. We've got the remember hotspot component added to it, and if I find the mesh, we've got the remember visibility component. And that'll be done for all of the scenes in our build. The last thing we need to do is do the same thing for the glasses that appear on our player prefab mesh. And that's because the auto add feature will not affect the player prefab, it only goes through the scenes. So let's drag the player into the scene temporarily, and we'll find the disguise again in her hierarchy. Now she's already got a constant ID from before, but we need the specific remember visibility component. So again, add component, save system, remember visibility. I'll check retain in prefab because we're going to be removing this from the scene in a moment. But I'm also going to change the visibility on start field to off because we're going to have the mesh renderer disabled by default, and only when she picks up the glasses will we be enabling it. I'll check apply, remove her from the scene, and to show the same example, I'll start the game by saving, pick up the coin, which then gets added to the inventory, and now if I load back, the camera started off in the correct place, we no longer have the coin, in our inventory, and the coin hotspot is re-enabled. Let's now go and add a nice feature to any adventure game, and that is the ability to skip cutscenes, because it's nice to be able to cut through some cutscenes that we've seen before. Let's go to the Settings Manager, and you can see about halfway down we've got a list of our available inputs. And this lists any inputs that we can add to our input manager that will have an effect. And it'll change dynamically based on what your other settings are, but one input that is always here is End Cutscene. Now what each of these do are listed in the manual, but the End Cutscene input is used to skip through any gameplay blocking cutscene. Now, by cutscene in this context, I'm not just referring to the cutscene logic prefab, but any action list such as a trigger or an action list asset that just happens to block gameplay while it's running. And that is incidentally set within any action list's when running field in their inspector. So by default, any action list is set to pause gameplay, but if you don't want it to interrupt gameplay, you can set it to run in background instead. But with that said, let's now define that end cutscene input in our input manager. So I'll go to Edit, Project Settings, Input, and I'll create a new axis by increasing the size by 1. I'll name this, matching the one in the Settings Manager, End Cutscene. And just so it doesn't conflict with the default menu input, I'll set the positive button to space. So when we hit the space bar, it'll end our currently running cutscene. We can test this out by looking at this sign over here. And if I press space, it'll end mid-sentence, and then we can carry on playing the game. Now, for a lot of cases, that will be enough, but complications do arise when we're dealing with animations, in particular those that are run using animator parameters. So, as an example, let's go to the market scene and have a look at our hotspot coin. So when we run the scene, we click on the coin, and I'll press space mid-action. And you can see, actually let's have a look at that again. You can see what happens is she actually bends down and picks it up twice. Now the coin is added instantly, and in fact we return to gameplay instantly. But there's an animation glitch here in that she is picking up the coin at the same time that we press the spacebar, as in when we end the cutscene, it will re-invoke the animator trigger parameter. Now there's a couple of things we need to do to fix this. The first is found by going to the hotspot coin use action list, and you can see we're running the trigger player anim action list asset, and you'll see now why it's a good idea to have such an asset that is used to run all of these triggers, because when we have a character animate action that is used to invoke a trigger parameter, we have an option named ignore when skipping. Now that is just a convenience because it's a common use case for it, but in fact we can have any action or series of actions not run when we skip a cutscene by going to add new action, action list, check running, and then check self is skipping. And then we can use this action to reroute our action list based on whether or not we are currently skipping. So now that this trigger is not going to be invoked when we're skipping, let's test again. Click on the coin and I'll skip. Okay, so this time she didn't bend down again, but notice that she also didn't snap back to her original idle position. And to explain why that is, we have to look at the animator that the player has. So I'll open up Click to Move. Now what we're doing in the action list is invoking these trigger parameters. And these parameters are actually separate from the animations that they cause, because AC is just modifying these, and the effect that they have on the animation is done within the animator. So AC doesn't really have a concept of what effect these actually have. So if we want the player to snap back to idle, we have to tell it to play the player idle manually. So we're going to create a new action that will reset to the player idle, but let's do it in an ActionList asset so that we can run it at any time. Back down in my Unity Adventure Remake subfolder, in my ActionList subfolder, I'll create one more ActionList, and this will be named Reset Player Anim. This is going to have a new action that's going to be a character animate. It's going to affect the player, and the method is going to be play custom, and here we enter in the name of the animation clip, which is player idle. And then down at the bottom of our coin use action list, we'll run this with an ActionList run action, where the source is asset file, and the ActionList asset is going to be this new reset player anim. Let's test this again. Click on the coin, and I press space midway through the animation, and it ends the cutscene instantly. We can now go and make the same change to our fish use action list, where we'll have an ActionList run action to run this reset player anim. The same with the coffeepot use. And the hotspot bird use action list. Again, I'll check ignore when skipping for both the player's animation and the bird's animation, and then add our action list run to reset the player. Now there is an added complication when it comes to this bird and glasses cutscene, because we don't have an animation to reset to. So if I reset the cutscene midway through skipping, the animation actually carries on. Now, it's a small cutscene, and it's only a couple of seconds long, so if the animation carries on in this instant, it's not really a big deal. But in a longer animation, it would be more noticeable. So let's go and fix that now. If we find the bird glasses cutscene and have a look at the animator, we've got just two states. We've got this idle and this fly away state. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new state that is just a one frame state that is the end of the fly away animation, and we're going to skip to that when we skip the cutscene. So this fly away animation is stored within the bird glasses cutscene model, and if I go to the animations tab, we have our list of animations here. So I'm going to add a new animation, and I'm going to call it end fly away. And this is all done in the same timeline, so I'm going to reduce the start and end frames to just the last frame. So I'll start at 246 and end at 247. I'll click apply. And then we can add this to the animator. So I'll drag end fly away into the animator, and I'll add a transition from fly away into this new state. And then viewing the transitions inspector, we'll leave has exit time on, but then just change the exit time, I suppose 1, and then with a transition duration of 0, because it's just going to be a one frame snap. And then what we can do is back in our bird use action, we can add one more character animate, an object animate action that's going to be affecting the mechanism engine, play custom. The animator is going to be our bird glasses cutscene, and the clip is going to be end fly away. So now let's test. And if I press space midway through the cutscene, you can see we now have the glasses instantly snapping to the floor. Let's add one or two minor tweaks just before we call it a day. Let's make it so that when we click on the ground, we have a visual indicator of where it is we've clicked. We can do that by assigning in the Settings Manager, underneath Movement Settings, a click marker. And this doesn't take any kind of special component. It's down to you to supply your own script or anything if you want it to be animated. But we can already find one pre-made for us inside Adventure Creator, Prefabs, Navigation, and then Click Marker. So I'll assign that in there. And you can see that at work when I click around the scene. You'll notice that if we are standing in front of a hotspot, for example this coin, we can't access it, we can't click on it, and that's because the player's in the way. So if we find the player in the Don't Destroy on Load scene, find her inspector, you can see that she's got a capsule collider and she's placed on the default layer. So let's find her original prefab and place her instead on the Ignore Raycast layer. And that isn't going to affect the way she moves or anything like that, but it does mean that our mouse clicks will go through. Lastly, let's just do something about our cursor. If you remember, when we've been going through all of our hotspots and defining our use interactions, we've been setting this cursor icon field to either use, talk to, or look at. So let's do something with those. Now, as I was saying before, these are defined in our cursor manager, which we can find in our AC game editor, and then clicking on the cursor tab. And we can edit and remove and so on, all of the icons that we can choose from. But let's make it so that these icons then appear when we are hovering over each hotspot with the mouse. So we can check Change Cursor based on interactions. I think I did actually forget to change the CoffeeBots cursor icon. Let me find it. Oh yes, we've got the CoffeeBots cursor icon. Let's change that to Talk To. And now if we hover over, say, this fish, we've got the use icon appears. If we hover over the CoffeeBot, we've got the talk icon appearing. Now we can change the sizes of these. Let's say maybe instead of 0.05, let's change it to 0.03 for each. And we can also amend the hotspot label that appears down at the bottom to also tell us what kind of interaction we're going to initiate. And we can do that by going to the hotspot cursor and checking prefix cursor labels. And now we get use fish, talk to CoffeeBot, and so on. So I think that wraps it up. I think this has been a pretty interesting tutorial to go through. I think we've got a fairly good approximation of the same game that Unity made as part of their own adventure tutorial. I'm of course very thankful to Unity for providing these assets because I think they make for a nice little game. They've got nice animation and sound, and hopefully it's made for a somewhat polished tutorial. If you are looking for more information on getting started with Adventure Creator, I suggest going to the Making a 2D Game tutorial, which covers a lot of the basics regardless of what perspective you're working in, and that, along with all of the tutorials, can be found on the Adventure Creator website, which you can easily access by going to Adventure Creator, Online Resources, and then Tutorials. Thanks very much for watching.